The barbarians showed us the place where the sun goes to rest. For it was the case that in these parts the nights were very short, in some places 2, in others 3 hours long, so that the sun rose again a short time after it had set.
This quote by Pytheas of Massalia is from his extraordinary voyage of discovery that took him to the most remote parts of Europe, where he saw things that no one from the classical world had ever witnessed before. In this video we will retrace his journey, which will take us to the tin mines of Britain, the mysterious island of Thule, the frozen sea of the Arctic, and the source of amber in the Baltic. Pytheas and his journey is not talked about much, but in my opinion it's one of the most interesting voyages from Antiquity. He set sail to regions of the world that were unknown to his people, and not to mention were considered to be uninhabitable. The only things he would be expected to find there was the stuff of myths and legends. He took it upon himself to investigate these strange lands, and what he found there will be revealed in this video. Pytheas wrote a book about this voyage, in which he describes his discoveries, and was the first documented account of the inhabitants of Britain and the area around the North Sea. The title of the book is often translated as On the Ocean, or more literally the translation would be Things About the Ocean. He must have written it sometime before 320 BCE, as it was soon after this date that it was first cited by the classical writer Deciarchus, a student of Aristotle. After which it was widely circulated, studied, dissected and argued about for at least the next few centuries, and until the writings of Tacitus and Julius Caesar, On the Ocean was probably the only source of information regarding Britain and the northern regions of Europe. Unfortunately, no copies of Pytheas' book survive, so most details of his voyage are unknown. What we do have are references and quotes from his book that later scholars used in their own works. So by looking at these, we can try and piece together where this voyage took him and what he saw there. Since this is such a long video and I have a lot to cover, I have marked the chapters in the description below, so if you want to skip to any specific part, feel free to do so. Before we cover the route of his journey, we will have a look at how we know about it and the sources we have for it. Snippets of his journey have come down to us through the surviving works of several writers that read Pytheas' now lost work. Notably, these people included Timaeus, Aristophanes, Pliny the Elder, Diodorus Siculus, Polybius and Strabo. Nowadays there is no doubt Pytheas travelled to the far north of Europe, even though we don't know the exact route he took to get there. But in ancient times not everyone believed him. Notably, Polybius and Strabo were openly hostile towards Pytheas and his voyage. But this might not have had much to do with the actual contents of his book, but more because of what has been referred to as professional jealousy. You see, Polybius, who lived about a century after Pytheas, was a bit of an explorer himself, and he had made voyages into the Atlantic as well. After this, he went to the Library of Alexandria, where he might have come across Pytheas' book. Polybius came to realize that someone from over 100 years ago had already explored more of the Atlantic than he had, and he might have tried to paint Pytheas as a liar in the hopes that his own work on that region might be seen as a more credible account. As for Strabo, it is unlikely that he would have had access to On the Ocean himself, relying more on other writers who had also quoted Pytheas in their own work. He seems to have mainly relied on Book 34 of Polybius' The Histories, which today only survives in fragments, and included Polybius' commentary on Pytheas' accounts. Thus, Strabo likely adopted Polybius' hostile attitude towards Pytheas. He quotes Pytheas a number of times in his famous work Geography, mainly to discredit him and cast doubt on the validity of his voyage. Strabo called Pytheas the worst possible liar and remarked that the majority of his writings were fabrications. Ironically enough, Strabo is nowadays one of the main sources for reconstructing Pytheas' journey. By contrast, other classical writers were entirely well disposed to Pytheas and accepted On the Ocean as a valid account. Foremost among these was the historian Timaeus. He lived around the time On the Ocean was published, so he likely had his own copy of it and quoted from it in his own works a number of times. The famous geographer and chief librarian of Alexandria, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, also referenced Pytheas in one of his famous books that was widely circulated in the ancient world, but has since also been lost to history. The Roman historian and writer Pliny the Elder received much of his information about Pytheas from Timaeus. Pliny quotes On the Ocean a number of times in his work Natural History. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who wrote Bibliotheca Historica, was also known to have used the writings of Timaeus, especially on the topic of ancient Britain. It wasn't just historians and geographers that were interested in Pytheas. His observations of the cosmos in the northern latitudes were also studied by the astronomical writer Geminus of Rhodes, and sun height measurements Pytheas took were used by Hipparchus to calculate the actual latitudes of where the readings were taken. Now I will talk a bit about the status of the world at the time of Pytheas. The familiar world was centered around the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and the navigable rivers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Beyond that, there were regions of extreme heat and extreme cold. The Greeks knew tin, amber, and gold came from the northern regions, but the exact origins of these materials was still a mystery. Rumors that there were tin isles, also known as the Cassiterites, laying somewhere off the Atlantic coast were widespread. The Phoenicians had set up a trading port just outside the Pillars of Hercules, which they called Gadir. This developed into the modern-day city of Cadiz in Spain. From here, Phoenician traders often went up and down the Atlantic coasts, but these were limited journeys, only lasting a few days before returning back to their port. They established trade with tribes to the north and set up trade routes to bring these sought-after materials to the Mediterranean. By the time of Pytheas, Cadiz and its trade routes were in the hands of the Carthaginians, who had blockaded the Straits of Gibraltar to prevent other nations' ships from reaching the sources of tin, copper, and gold found along the Atlantic coast. To the Greeks, the wild and unknown north was the home of people known only as the Hyperboreans. However, these northern regions existed only as a matter of wild imagination. As far as the ancient Greeks were concerned, the conditions of the north were thought to be too harsh and inhospitable for human habitation, and could only be described by myths and legends. This map represents the known world at the time of Pytheas, and he might have even brought along a copy of this map on his voyage. He would have been interested in learning more about this unexplored wasteland, and would have wanted to see if there was any truth to these mythical stories. We can derive from the fact that he wrote a book about his voyage that Pytheas did not set off for economic gain, because if he had, he would have wanted to keep the origins of these valuable resources a secret. Nonetheless, he might have needed economic backing, as Polybius and Strabo painted him as a poor man. But as mentioned before, they weren't big fans of him, so that might be the reason why they describe him as such. With the Carthaginians having a monopoly on the tin trade, the merchants of Massalia would have been eager for a share of this rich trade, and would have endeavored to establish new trade routes, but to do that they would have had to locate the origins of these resources first. Therefore, it is possible that they financed Pytheas' expedition, which might have provided the merchants of Massalia with the information they were looking for. Pytheas wasn't just an ordinary man. We don't know much about his background, but from what survives from his work, we can tell he was a highly intelligent man, an astronomer, and he observed the world with a scientific curiosity. During his journey, he observed how the days lengthened as he sailed further north, and took height measurements of the sun in different places, from which later scholars could work out their latitudes. He also noted that there was no star exactly over the North Pole, something that was true at his time. And he might have been the first to note that there is a link between the tides and the moon. Pytheas' scientific talents also enabled him to make some of the first accurate long-distance measurements in history. Not only did he estimate Britain's circumference, but he also measured the distance from the northern reaches of Scotland to his hometown of Massalia. His estimate was approximately 1050 miles, or 1690 kilometers, which is quite close to the actual distance of 1120 miles or 1800 kilometers. His hometown of Massalia, being modern-day Marseille in southern France, was founded as a Greek outpost surrounded by Celts, with whom the city often traded. This makes it possible that Pytheas may have known how to speak some Celtic, which he could have used in communicating with the locals during his travels. Although the further north he went, the more unintelligible the local Celtic dialects would become. But here he could have used what he knew to find interpreters more familiar with the regional dialects. Now we come to the point where we are going to try and reconstruct Pytheas' journey. Please note that, as mentioned before, Pytheas' book does not survive, so along with the knowledge that we do have from other classical writers who wrote about Pytheas' findings, there will also be quite a lot of speculation to fill in the gaps of his journey that we don't know much about. Making this video has taken me months of work, so if you've enjoyed it so far, please consider leaving a like or a comment and subscribe to my channel, which will make the YouTube algorithm recommend this video to more people. And if you feel like I deserve it, you can support me further by leaving a super thanks on this video, or supporting me through Patreon or YouTube memberships. The year in which Pytheas set off on his journey is unknown, but it is thought to have been sometime around 330 BCE. He is the only person mentioned by name, so the only thing we can say for sure is that he was present during this journey. We can assume that he might have traveled with local guides and interpreters along the way, but it is unclear if he brought anyone along from Massalia to aid him in his research. It could be likely that he did, as he would have needed to bring supplies with him, such as parchment to note down his findings, as well as having brought scientific equipment such as a gnomon, which was used to take measurements of the sun's height, which in turn was later used to calculate latitudes. Pretty much as soon as he set off, we don't exactly know which way he went. There are two possible routes he might have taken. The first option is that he went by ship through the Pillars of Hercules and past Cadiz. The second option is that he used the rivers of southern France to cross overland to the Atlantic. I'll cover the sea route first, which in addition to being the longer of the two, also had the issue of the Carthaginian blockade which I mentioned earlier that might have been in effect at that time. Now there is a possibility that he sailed through at a time when the blockade was temporarily lifted, but in case it was still blockaded, he could have avoided being detected by staying close to land and sailing only at night. He would only have to sneak past if he was using a Greek ship, and even though it is a possibility that he did the whole journey in his own ship, It is far more likely that he switched from local ship to local ship at different ports, and this way he might have boarded a Carthaginian ship somewhere along the Iberian coast and gotten through the blockade without having to hide. Switching ships would also make sense for the overland route, as he would have had to travel on foot for part of this journey. Additionally, ships built for the relatively calm Mediterranean would struggle in the rough waters of the Atlantic. This overland way to reach the Atlantic would have been known to the Massaliots already, as the navigable rivers of southern France were established trade routes, which is shown by the spread of Greek amphorae and other pottery that was found all across this region. If he took the overland route, which in my opinion is the more likely of the two, he could have sailed down the coast from Massalia to the Greek port of Agde, then to the estuary of the Aude, with a possible stop at the native port of Narbeau. He could have sailed up the river as far as Carcassonne, then crossed overland to Tolosa, where river transport could have brought him down the Gironde River to the Atlantic. This overland trip could have been completed in little over a week, compared to sailing around Iberia, which could have taken multiple weeks. When he reached the Gironde estuary, he would have stopped off at the settlement of Burdigala, which is modern-day Bordeaux, as here he could have changed to an ocean-going vessel, suited for the fierce Atlantic. These ships would have been very different to the ships he was used to. Although no mention of these from his books survive, there is a quote from Julius Caesar a few centuries later about the ships from this region.
The Gauls' own ships were built and rigged in a different manner from ours. They were made with much flatter bottoms to help them ride shallow water caused by shoals or ebb tides. Exceptionally high bows and sterns fitted them for use in heavy seas and violent gales, and the hulls were made entirely of oak to enable them to stand any amount of shocks and rough usage. The cross timbers, which consisted of beams a foot wide, were fastened with iron bolts as thick as a man's thumb. The anchors were secured with iron chains instead of ropes. They used sails made of rawhides or thin leather, either because they had no flax and were ignorant of its use, or more probably because they were thought that ordinary sails would not stand the violent storms and squalls of the Atlantic and were not suitable for such heavy vessels. In meeting them, the only advantage our ships possessed was that they were faster and could be propelled by oars. In other respects, the enemies were much better adapted for sailing such treacherous and stormy waters. We could not injure them by ramming because they were so solidly built, and their height made it difficult to reach them with missiles or board them with grappling irons. Moreover, when it began to blow hard and they were running before the wind, they weathered the storm more easily. They could bring into shallow water with greater safety, and when left aground by the tide, had nothing to fear from reefs or pointed rocks, whereas to our ships, all these risks were formidable.
He continued his journey up the Atlantic coast and towards Armorica, which we call Brittany today. Part of this account survives in a quote from Strabo's Geography.
The bulge of Europe outside the Pillars of Hercules, set against Iberia and sloping towards the west, reaching not less than 3,000 stadia. We must also add all the capes, but in particular that of the Ostimioi, which is called Kobean, and the surrounding islands, the farthest of which, Uxisame, Pytheas says, is a 3 days' sail away. All these places lie towards the north and belong to Celtica.
Strabo points out that he was just repeating what was written down by Aristophanes, who in turn got his info from Pytheas. Dissecting this quote, we can assume that this bulge of Europe is Armorica, on which there is a peninsula he called Kobean, where a tribe called the Ostimioi lived, their name meaning the farthest, or those at the end of the world. Based on this description, the Kobean Peninsula is thought to be Point du Ross, which is the westernmost peninsula of Brittany. He also mentioned that the westernmost island along the Armorican coast is Uxisame, which would be modern-day Ushant. We don't know if he went ashore on this part of his journey, but if he did, he may have been interested in the ancient standing stones that are found in this region. However, thanks to a sun height measurement he took, we can confidently say that he did go on shore on the northern part of Brittany, as these sun height measurements can only be taken from land. Before we go back to the journey, I'll talk more about the sun height measurements he took and their significance. During his journey, Pytheas took sun height measurements in a number of places, and before he had also taken one in his hometown of Massalia. This way he was able to gauge the relative distance he had travelled from the starting point of his journey to his current location. Pytheas himself could not convert these measurements into latitudes, but the astronomer and mathematician Hipparchus, who lived around 200 years later, could. In order to calculate the latitude, Hipparchus needed to know three things: the obliquity of the sun's apparent path, the circumference of the Earth, and the sun height measurement from a location. These first two Hipparchus already figured out himself. All he needed were measurements from a variety of places, which he found in Pytheas' book. Now, in order for these measurements to be accurate, it needed to meet some requirements. First of all, it had to be taken using a gnomon, which is a kind of surveying staff. It was put into the ground, and the height of the staff in relation to the length of the shadow it formed on the ground was noted down. Secondly, these measurements had to be taken at noon on the day of the summer solstice. Does this mean Pytheas only had one chance a year to make a single measurement? Luckily the answer is no, as he could have made readings at noon on other days, and as long as he knew the interval between that date and the nearest summer solstice, he would be able to calculate what the sun height would be there on the day of the summer solstice. Based on the data taken from Pytheas, Hipparchus was able to convert these measurements into cubits of the sun's elevation, the distance between latitudes in stadia, and the number of daylight hours on the longest day of the year, which was also used as a measurement of distance. Later on, Strabo was also able to convert Hipparchus' measurements into degrees of latitude. That gives us this table, which I'll fill out during the journey as he takes his measurements. Just while we are on the topic of Hipparchus, he also mentions that Pytheas made the observation that there was no star at the celestial North Pole. Nowadays there is, that being the North Star, but due to the precession of the Earth's axis, it means that during Pytheas' time this was actually correct.
No single star lies at the pole, but an empty space near which lie 3 stars. The spot marking the pole, aided by these, encloses a figure nearly resembling a quadrilateral exactly, in fact, as Pytheas the Massalia says.
As stated earlier, Hipparchus converted these measurements into latitudes, and this line represents the latitude of the measurement he took here. He might not have landed exactly on this line, as some inherent errors can be expected, and since it wasn't possible to determine longitudes, all we can say is that Pytheas went ashore somewhere along the northern coast of Brittany. We can speculate that if he was travelling on an Atlantic trade ship, it would have stopped at a prominent port, and the only Iron Age port that we know of in that region was Leuillet. So there is a possibility that this is where the measurement was taken. In comparison to the people of Britain, Pytheas didn't write much about the people of Armorica, or if he did, these descriptions have been lost to history. So we don't exactly know how long he stayed here. However long he stayed, at some point he would have left one of the northern ports of Brittany to cross the Channel in search of the origins of tin. The existence of the British Isles had been briefly mentioned by the Carthaginian explorer Himilco 1 or 2 centuries before Pytheas, and Phoenicians occasionally came to the southern ports to trade for tin. But Pytheas was the first one to give a detailed account of the inhabitants there, as well as the first to explore beyond the southern coast. Crossing the English Channel could have been done within a day. When he arrived on the British coast, he made his way along it westwards, towards Land's End in Cornwall, as they would have heard from the Armorican merchants that this is the place where tin came from. He called the southwestern tip of Britain Belerion. Diodorus gives an account that describes the working of Cornish tin. It's very likely that at least some of his info has come from Pytheas, as the detail into which Diodorus goes suggests that he was working from a first-hand account.
The inhabitants of Britain who dwell about the promontory, known as Belerion, are especially hospitable to strangers and have adopted a civilized manner of life because of their intercourse with merchants of other peoples. They it is who work the tin, treating the bed which bears it in an ingenious manner. This bed, being like rock, contains earthly seams, and in them the workers quarry the ore, which they then mount down and cleanse of its impurities. Then they work the tin into pieces the size of knuckle bones and convey it to an island which lies off Britain, and it is called Ictus. For at the time of ebb tide, the space between this island and the mainland become dry, and they can take the tin in large quantities over to the island on their wagons. And a peculiar thing happens in the case of the neighbouring islands which lie between Europe and Britain, for at flood tide the passages between them and the mainland run full, and they have the appearances of islands, but at ebb tide the sea recedes and leaves dry a large space, and at that time they look like peninsulas. On the island of Ictus, the merchants purchase the tin of the natives and carry it from there across the straits to Gaul, and finally, making their way on foot through Gaul for some 30 days, they bring their wares on horseback to the mouth of the river Rhone.
This tells us a lot. First, there was a good and established trade network linking Cornwall to the European mainland. Secondly, the Britons mined the earth for tin ore, and they refined that ore themselves into knuckle-bone-sized nuggets. These nuggets were brought to a place called Ictus, where it would be traded with foreign merchants. A specific trade route is also mentioned here. Since Diodorus was writing this a few hundred years after Pytheas, it's possible that this trade route wasn't yet established at this time. Earlier I mentioned that one of the possible reasons for which Pytheas undertook his journey was because the merchants of Massalia were looking for alternative trade routes so they could get a more direct source of tin. Could it be that thanks to Pytheas exploring this area, this trade route was established? As the mouth of the river Rhone at the end of this described route is just down the coast of the city of Massalia. There's also a quote from Pliny referring to an island called Myctus. Quoting Timaeus, he says,
"The historian Timaeus says there is an island named Myctus lying 6 days' sail inwards from Britain, where tin is to be found, and to which the Britons cross the boats of wickerwork covered with stitched hides."
Are Ictus and Myctus the same island? The name would suggest so, but there are differences. Diodorus says Ictus lays off the coast of Britain, with the tin being transported to it over land during low tide, while Pliny says it lays 6 days' sail inwards from Britain, with inwards meaning that it was closer to the Mediterranean, which would put it somewhere along the coast of western France. And is Pliny referring to tin being found on the island of Myctus, or does he mean it in regards to Britain? It could be that they are referring to different islands, or that Pliny might have made an error in his description, as out of the two quotes, Diodorus seems to have the more accurate information. So this island was a trading hub for tin, which foreign merchants could reach by boat at high tide, and where the locals would bring their supplies by land at low tide. Or perhaps also by boats made of wicker and hides. The exact location of Ichthys hasn't been determined, and scholars have argued it to be anywhere from the Isles of Scilly to the west to the Isle of Thanet in Kent. Thanet seems to be too far east to make a convincing argument for, and the Isles of Scilly aren't accessible by foot from mainland Britain, although these islands do form land bridges between each other at low tide. As Diodorus mentions, there are quite a few islands in the area between that connect to the mainland or are islands depending on the tides. But which one of these could be Ichthys? Some of them are more likely candidates than others, including St. Michael's Mount, Louis Island, the Mountbatten Peninsula, and the Isle of Wight. Of these, St. Michael's Mount and Mountbatten are the most plausible. Both are close to tin deposits, so locals wouldn't have to travel far, and while St. Michael's Mount seems to fit the description better, being an island at high tide and a peninsula at low tide, there hasn't been any considerable archaeological evidence that there was a center of trade there. On the other hand, Mountbatten is a peninsula and not an island. Even though it is possible it could have been an island at high tide during the time of Pytheas. And in ancient Greek, the term that is used to refer to islands is in some cases also used to refer to peninsulas, so even if it was a peninsula, it wouldn't be out of the question. Especially seeing as at Mountbatten, archaeologists have found wares that weren't native to Britain, likely being brought there by foreign traders. It is also flanked by safe anchorages for ships, so we can say it was a trading port of some kind, but we can't know for sure that this was Ichthys specifically. Before continuing with the voyage, I will try to map out this area of Britain a bit further. Diodorus wrote that Britain was like a triangle, with the corners being Belerion, Orcas and Cantian, that being Cornwall, the Orkney Islands and Kent. Pliny also says,
Britannia Island. Albion was its own name when all were called the Britanniae, according to Pytheas and Isidorus. The circuit is 4,875 miles in extent.
So the main island of Britain was called Albion by the locals, with the Britannies referring to it and the surrounding islands. Pliny then goes on to list some places that were part of the Britannies, including the number of islands they had: 40 Orcades, 7 Haemodes, 30 Hebudes, Mona, Monopia, Virginia, Vectis, and so on. Pliny wrote this hundreds of years after Pytheas, so is it possible that Pytheas had described some of these and that perhaps some of these names were given by him? It is believed that the name Britain itself has come down to us from Pytheas. Diodorus Siculus called the island of Britain Britannia, and its inhabitants the Britanni. These terms he likely got from Pytheas, with later writers switching out the P for B, giving the word Britannia, that becoming Britain. This suggests that Pytheas must have spent a lot of time interacting with the people living on the southern and western regions of Britain, and less with the people inhabiting the northern part of the island. This is because it has been speculated that the name for the natives of Britain was the Britanni or the Britanni, with the former being used more to refer to the people of the south of the island, being the origin of the word Britannia, whereas Brittany was used more with the northern people. These terms are thought to mean something along the lines of the painted ones or the tattooed folk, with the southern term Brittany persisting in Welsh, having become the word for Britain, Prydain, and the northern term Brittany becoming the base for the term Picts. With Britain essentially meaning land of the painted folk, it would be odd for the locals to use this term to refer to their own land, possibly instead using the term Albion, as Pliny mentioned. In naming Britain, Pytheas might have heard the Armoricans calling the inhabitants of Britain the Brittany, and misunderstanding this to be the name of the landmass, he might have called the island Britannicae, which later turned into Britannia and then Britannia. After having found the source of tin, Pytheas travelled north along the west coast of Britain, and is claimed to have travelled much of the length of Britain by foot, a claim that Polybius is highly critical of.
Many people have been led astray by him, by his statement that he traversed the whole of Britannica by foot.
While Pytheas, of course, would not have travelled on foot the whole way, it's not impossible that he did travel over land for large stretches of his journey, as he would have been interested not only in the geography of the region, but also in the people who lived there. He is thought to have spent quite some time in Britain, possibly months or even years. So perhaps he did walk most of the way, or maybe he meant it as in he travelled by ship along the western coast of Britain, but made a lot of stops doing so to take in the surroundings in every place he went ashore. If he did indeed stay in Britain for such a long time, he must have written a lot about the inhabitants. We'll never know all the details of what he observed, but Diodorus summarizes it here.
And Britain, we are told, is inhabited by tribes who are indigenous and preserve in their way of life ancient customs. For example, they use chariots in their wars, and their dwellings are humble, being built for the most part out of reeds or timber. The method they employ of harvesting their grain crops is to cut off no more than the heads and store them away in roofed buildings. And then each day they pick out the ripened heads and grind them, in this way getting their food. As for their habits, they are simple and far removed from the shrewdness and vice that characterize the men of our day. Their way of life is modest, since they are beyond the reach of luxury which comes from wealth. The island is thickly populated, and the climate is extremely cold. It is held by many kings and aristocrats who for the most part live at peace among themselves.
The described method of harvesting is interesting. The growing grain crop would have been grasped just below the heads and cut with an iron reaping knife, leaving the stalks in the field. This would have had a few advantages. It would reduce the amount of material that had to be transported and stored in their warehouses. Additionally, the stalks and the other weeds that were left in the field could be used as food for a variety of livestock, as these were left to graze the field in successive waves. The cows would get first pickings, then the sheep would be brought in to eat the lower vegetation left by the cows, and finally the pigs would root through the dirt for whatever was left and simultaneously break up the soil, mixing in the manure of them and the previous animals, thus fertilizing the ground for the next growing season. The exact route he took north is of course not known to us, but he might have visited the Isle of Mann, as around this point in his travels he made another measurement, with the corresponding latitude going straight through that island. Or he could have also made the measurement on mainland Britain, it just being a coincidence that the latitude lines up with the Isle of Man. We can't say for sure, but if he did go to the Isle of Man, he might have used a boat made of wicker and hides. These kinds of boats were mentioned by Pliny earlier in the section on Ichthys. These wicker and hide boats are also thought to have been common back then, and this is a technique of boat building that is still practiced today. These types of boats are known as curraghs. Although our contemporary versions are quite small, back then they would have been made bigger. Don't let their appearance of sticks and hides fool you, as these, while looking quite flimsy, are surprisingly sturdy and water resistant when constructed in the right way. No surviving examples from the time of Pytheas have been found, but a gold model of such a ship has been. This model depicted a boat that was a lot bigger than the curraghs of today. Inside, there were 9 benches for rowers and 18 oars. There was a steering oar at the back and a mast in the center with a square sail. This would have been a vessel that was capable of long sea voyages on rough seas. After he took this measurement, he continued north. And although there is no evidence to suggest that Pytheas ever went to Ireland, somewhere along the way up, he might have heard stories of the Hyerni or the Iverni, which were the people living on modern-day Ireland. Strabo says,
Concerning this island, I have nothing certain to tell, except that its inhabitants are more savage than the Britons, since they are man-eaters as well as heavy-eaters, and since, further, they consider it an honourable thing, when their fathers die, to devour them, and openly to have intercourse, not only with the other women, but also with their mothers and sisters. But I am saying this only with the understanding that I have no trustworthy witnesses for it.
While not mentioning Pytheas here by name, he says he has no trustworthy witness, which, knowing Strabo's views on Pytheas, could mean that Pytheas might have reported something along these lines. Strabo's quote about the man-eaters might actually be true, as similar stories were also recorded by Christian missionaries from the 4th century, and there is archaeological evidence for cannibalism in Ireland, and in some parts of Britain as well. As he travelled up the coast, he would have seen the landscape change dramatically, to one dominated by rocks, steep cliffs and narrow inlets, with the dwellings made of timber and turf, which were common in the southern parts, replaced by stone dwellings partially sunken into the ground in order to protect its inhabitants from the strong North Atlantic gales. The next measurement he took was in modern-day Scotland, lining up with the island of Lewis. But of course there is also a possibility that he did this on the mainland. If he did come by boat to Lewis, he might have landed in the settlement which would later become Stornoway. And as Pytheas had an interest in astronomy, he might have visited the standing stones of Callanish. As we have seen so far, Pytheas has made 3 measurements. And if he had waited for a solstice to measure every one of these, that would mean that he spent over 2 years in Britain, which, if we go by the traversing Britain on foot claim, could make sense. But alternatively, as mentioned before, he could have also carried these out in a much shorter time frame if he kept track of the number of days separating his measurements from the closest solstice. Still, to be as accurate as possible, it would be best for him to have taken it as close to the solstice as he could. So in my opinion, there is a strong argument to be made that he did spend a very long time in Britain. During this time, he could have either walked along the coast or alternatively anchored his ship at the port for some time and making journeys inland, then returning to the port to continue on by ship. Please note that while on the maps I've been showing one possible route by sea and another possible route by foot, these should not be seen as absolutely separate from each other, as Pytheas could have easily switched from one to another at any point in his journey. I've just not shown him interchanging between them very much on the map, as it would be too messy. Next, he would have travelled to Orkney. Pliny quotes Pytheas as saying there are 40 Orcades separated by moderate distance, which is an accurate account when including all the smaller islands, showing that Pytheas spent a good amount of time here. Perhaps he would have been interested in the standing stones that were built on Orkney as well, which by then would have been as ancient to Pytheas as he is to us today. Pytheas had an interest in the tides and seemed to have written a lot about them. As we saw previously, he had observed the tide creating islands from peninsulas in southern Britain, which would have been tremendously intriguing for someone who was used to the relatively minute tidal changes in the Mediterranean. According to Aetius, a philosopher and scientist, Pytheas was the first person to link the tide to the phases of the moon. Although he could not explain exactly how these influenced each other, he might have learned there was a correlation from the locals around the Atlantic coast, as undoubtedly, with these high changes in the tides, these locals might have figured this out already as well. But here on Orkney, Pytheas reported there to be monster tides. His description of these was one of Pliny the Elder's main sources for a part in his book called Why the Tides of the Sea Rise and Fall, and where extraordinary tides occur. Here, Pliny says,
Above Britannia, tidal waters swell to a height of 80 cubits.
80 cubits, being about 35 meters, is way above the normal tide range in this area. In the right conditions, tidal surges here can create waves up to 20 meters, but at times it has been known that some freak events can occur around the northern Scottish waters. For example, in 1862, there was a tidal event that swept water across the land and waves that surmounted 70-meter high cliffs. Maybe Pytheas heard stories of such events from the locals, or perhaps even experienced one himself. He is thought to have gone to Shetland as well, where another measurement was made. As here it was noted as being less than 3 cubits, rather than an exact number, it might point to this one having been more of an estimation rather than an exact measurement. Beyond northern Scotland, Pytheas described there was an island called Thule. As a little side note, there are also other ways to pronounce this island's name, such as Thule or Thule, but I'll refer to it as Thule in this video. It is not clear whether Pytheas actually went to Thule or merely recorded what he heard about it from the locals of northern Scotland. But before we can look into if he actually went there, we have to figure out which landmass Thule is supposed to be referring to. There are a few options. It could be Iceland, Norway, Shetland, or the Faroe Islands. Some people even seem to think it might have been Greenland or North America, but these seem to be too ridiculous to take seriously. I'll list what we know about Thule and compare it to these viable options. It was described as an island, which supports Iceland, Shetland and the Faroe Islands. It's worth noting that people of the time may have thought that Norway was an island as well. I say this because there's precedent for it. The southern tip of Sweden was presumed to be an island for a very long time, as ancient explorers had not yet mapped Scandinavia fully and didn't know it connected to Eurasia at the far end of the Baltic Sea. When we obscure the parts they didn't know about, it becomes more reasonable to see why they thought this, as the shores that were known to them were surrounded by water on nearly every side. So could a similar mistake have been made with Norway? It's worth pondering, but I feel that it is less likely. Unlike the southern tip of Sweden, Norway's coastline is, in the grand scheme of things, mostly straight, so you can't even partially sail around it. There are of course all the fjords. Without going into every one of them, it would be hard to confirm that these individual peninsulas created by the fjords aren't islands in themselves. But if all of these were presumed to be islands, and of course there are also a lot of actual islands in this area, I would have assumed that the people who described this place wouldn't have used the singular term island, but instead would have used something like archipelago to indicate how many islands there are here. An important characteristic of Thule was that it was a place where there were 21 to 22 hour days, and at the summer solstice the sun doesn't set.
Thule, where there are no nights during the solstice when the sun is passing through the sign of Cancer, and also no days during the winter solstice. Some believe this is true for 6 continuous months.
This knocks out Shetland as well as the Faroe Islands, which are too far south for this. And in all honesty, the only reason Shetland was even suggested as Thule appears to have been because the flawed reasoning of earlier scholars who were convinced it was impossible to cross the northern Atlantic with the technology that was available at that time. This is a false assumption, and I'll come back to it later to explain why. So that leaves Iceland and Norway. There is a quote from Strabo which has split the opinions of people studying the location of Thule.
Concerning Thule, our historical information is still more uncertain on account of its outside position. For Thule, of all the countries that are named, is set farthest north. But that the things which Pytheas has told about Thule, as well as the other places in that part of the world, have indeed been fabricated by him, we have clear evidence from the districts that are known to us, for in most cases he has falsified them, as I have already said before, and hence he is obviously more false concerning the districts which have been placed outside the inhabited world. And yet, if judged by the science of the celestial phenomena and by mathematical theory, he might possibly seem to have made adequate use of the facts as regards the people who live close to the chilly zone, when he says that of the animals and domesticated fruits, there is an utter lack of some and a scarcity of the others, and that the people live on millet and other herbs, and on fruits and roots, and where there are grain and honey, the people get their beverage also from them. As for the grain, he says, since they have no pure sunshine, they pound it out in large storehouses, after first gathering the ears together there, for the outside threshing floors become useless because of this lack of sunshine, and because of the rains.
With this, some people have assumed that he is talking about people who inhabit Thule, and as Iceland was uninhabited at that time, Thule cannot be Iceland, and thus must be Norway. Others say there is no reason to assume that the description of the people in this quote has anything to do with Thule, as the line, as regards to the people who live close to the chilly zone, forms a clear separation from the description of Thule in the text, and instead might refer to the people of northern Britain in general. There might be something to this, as we can see similarities when we compare it to Diodorus' earlier quote describing the people of Britain. It's clear to see that these sections regarding grain come from the same source text, which Diodorus attributes to be about the Britons. But let's also look at it from another angle. Let's say Strabo did actually intend this to be a description of the inhabitants of Thule. As a side note here, Strabo wouldn't have believed this himself, as he put Thule outside of the inhabited world based on its latitude being too far north, and he would only say this for the sake of argument. But yeah, what if Strabo did indeed mean this, as in this is a description of the attributes of the people of Thule? In that case, I'd like to point out this quote.
Now, Pytheas of Massalia tells us that Thule, the most northerly of the Britannic islands, is farthest north, and that there the circle of the summer tropic is the same as the Arctic circle.
Here Strabo relays what Pytheas says, which is this. Now that isn't relevant right now. What I wanted to point out is what Strabo added to this. He describes Thule as being part of the Britannic Islands. If Strabo saw Thule as Britain, and Pytheas described the people of Britain like this, then Strabo might have mistakenly extended the description to also apply to Thule. After all, for all that Strabo calls Pytheas a liar and discredits his claims as false, Strabo isn't beyond making faults of his own. I mean, just look at where he put Ireland on his map. Out of these three ways to interpret Strabo's quote, I am personally a supporter of the last option. But depending on where you fall on this discussion, Norway might get a point. But I think this is a mistake on Strabo's part, so I'm not counting that. Both Strabo and Pliny report that Pytheas says Thule is a 6-day sail north of Britain, which could have led him to Iceland, perhaps the region around Vestrahorn, or if we want to say he went to Norway, it could have landed him around the modern-day city of Trondheim. But note that Norway is more to the east from here, rather than north as the text suggests. As you might have noticed, I'm leaning more towards Iceland, so I will make the assumption that Thule is Iceland for the remainder of the video. My reasoning, in addition to the points that I just mentioned, also lies in the possible link that the people of northern Britain might have had with Iceland, which I will elaborate on now. We know it is possible to reach Iceland in hide-covered boats, as Irish monks were recorded to have gone there in the 8th century, using their curraghs. By the time this was first recorded, the practice of Irish monks going to Iceland was already established, so perhaps they had been going there for centuries before that. And could it be that the knowledge of this place was passed down to them from earlier peoples of the northern coasts, who themselves may have already reached the island even before the time of Pytheas? After all, they would have already had the technology to get there if they wanted to, as the types of boats the Irish monks would later use already existed at this time. But what might have led people to go out in the open ocean and look for Iceland? Ancient mariners would have developed a heightened sense of navigation, taking clues from the water, sky and wind to sense if there was land nearby. But this alone would not have been enough to identify a whole new landmass in the middle of the North Atlantic. They would have gotten a hint from birds, as migrating flocks would be seen setting off out over the ocean. After seeing the birds come and go for a number of years, inquisitive mariners from northern Scotland might have wondered where they went and set sail after the birds. This probably took some trial and error, but through this they could have discovered the Shetlands, Faroes, and ultimately even Iceland. From his records it is clear that the people here went to Thule, but then the question remains, did Pytheas actually go there, or was he just relaying stories he heard from the locals? A statement by Geminus of Rhodes quotes on the ocean.
To these regions the Massalian Pytheas seems also to have come. He says, at least in his treatise, On the Ocean, the barbarians showed us the place where the sun goes to rest. For it was the case that in these parts the nights were very short, in some places 2, in others 3 hours long, so that the sun rose again a short time after it had set.
21 to 22 hour days could have been observed in most of Iceland, but the day without night, as mentioned by Pliny earlier, only occurring in the Arctic Circle, which just about touches the northern tips of Iceland. Yet even below this line, there would still be places where the sun is just below the horizon, but still providing enough ambient light to be considered daytime. It's also worth mentioning that due to the gradually changing axial tilt of the Earth, the Arctic Circle was actually further south than it is today. This wouldn't have made a huge difference, only 25 kilometers or so, but that would mean that back then more of Iceland would have fallen under these conditions. During my research, I found it mentioned in a few places that Pytheas observed the Northern Lights, as well as being the first to describe them. Yet I couldn't find any ancient source quoting Pytheas on such observations. Whether or not he would have seen Northern Lights is really dependent on what time of the year he was there. If it was winter with long dark nights, the likelihood goes up, but if he was there during the summer, when it would be light most of the day, the chances decrease dramatically. As Pytheas was really focused on the long daylight hours in this region, I would imagine he would have been here during the summer. Yet if he was very lucky, he could have seen some during summertime as well. But if he did, no description of him observing it survives. To give you an indication of what observing an aurora borealis might have felt like to a person from antiquity, I'll share this quote from Pliny, in which he is thought to be describing this phenomenon.
There also occurs a yawning of the actual sky, called chasma, and also something that looks like blood and flames that fall from it to the earth. Nothing is more dreaded by mortals.
A day's sail north of Thule, Pytheas is said to have reported, brings you to the Congealed Sea. This is believed to be the frozen Arctic Ocean, preventing them from going any further. At one point in his work, Polybius gives examples of things Pytheas reported that Polybius simply can't accept to be true. Here he gives a description of this place.
Those parts where neither earth was in existence by itself, nor sea nor vapor, but instead a sort of mixture of these, rather like a marine lung in which the earth and the sea and all things are together suspended, and this is as if it were a fetter of the whole, existing in a form impassable by foot or ship.
To this, Strabo adds,
The thing like a lung he himself had seen, but other things he spoke of from hearsay.
The odd term sea lung has long been the source of speculation among modern scholars. It is not entirely clear to what Pytheas was referring to. The most rational explanation, and the one that has been adopted by most researchers, is that Pytheas was using this Greek term in order to describe a phenomenon that we now know as pancake ice, which no Mediterranean would have witnessed before, and thus no term for it existed. Pancake ice is characteristically round and floats on top of the water. Pytheas' term sea lung was also another word for jellyfish. It too is round and often floats near the top of the water surface. So it is believed that in an attempt to describe what he saw, Pytheas simply felt that the term sea lung most accurately described this weird sight. As for that weird mixture of matter that Pytheas was describing in Polybius' quote, he most likely saw a mix of sea, slush and ice surrounded by dense fog, which I suppose someone could interpret as the states of matter, solid, liquid and gas, blending together into one form. The information on Thule and the Congealed Sea all seem to make sense. Could Pytheas have learned all of this just from stories that the locals told him? Or did he actually see it for himself? Again, we can't say definitively, but for the sake of the video, I will assume that he did go there. Before continuing, I want to talk about a last quote from Strabo regarding Thule, which might highlight one of Pytheas' strengths. For a bit of context on this quote, Strabo is commenting on Aristophanes' description of the distances between the limits of the known world.
However, with one exception, let all the distances of Eratosthenes be granted him, for they are sufficiently agreed upon. But what man of sense could grant his distance from the Borysthenes to the parallel of Thule? For not only has the man who tells about Thule, Pytheas, been found, upon scrutiny, to be an arc falsifier, but the men who have seen Britain and Yern do not mention Thule, though they speak of other islands, small ones, about Britain.
Ignoring the hate which we have come to expect from Strabo, the thing to note here is that no other explorer who has gone to Britain has found Thule. Keep in mind this was written hundreds of years after Pytheas came here, and Britain was no longer as remote as it had been to him. So how come no other explorer managed to find it? I believe it stems from what kind of man Pytheas was. As I mentioned earlier, Pytheas wasn't just interested in the land he was exploring, he was interested in its people as well. He possibly spent months or even years getting to know the inhabitants of Britain, learning about their customs, earning their trust, and gaining local knowledge from them. Perhaps this is what led him to learn about this mysterious island of Thule. And as Geminus told us in his quote, it were the locals who showed Pytheas to Thule. Without them, he may have never known about it. And it might have just been the strive to interact with the locals that those other explorers were lacking. Before returning home, Pytheas wanted to discover where amber came from. Amber was prized in the Greek world, and it was known to come from somewhere in the north of Europe. Massalia even had trading outposts as far north as the Lower Rhine, but no Mediterranean traveller had reached Germany by sea. The route Pytheas took to get there is unclear, but to me the most likely is that he went down the East British coast to Kent, or the region he called Cantillon, then crossed the Strait of Dover and travelled up the European mainland's coast. This route would also best fit with the claim that he circumnavigated the whole of Britain. Not much survives from Pytheas' accounts of the Amber Coast, but here is a quote from Pliny.
Pytheas said that the Gunnus, a people of Germany, inhabited the shores of an estuary of the ocean called Metonomon, their territory extending a distance of 6,000 stadia. From there, the island of Abalus is 1 day's voyage away, upon the shores of which amber is thrown up by the waves in spring, it being an excretion of the sea in a congealed form, as also that the inhabitants use this amber as wood for fire, and sell it to their neighbors, the Teutons. Timaeus also believes Pytheas, but called the island Basilia.
Nowadays we know that there are two main sources of amber in Northern Europe. Juttish amber, found along the north coast of the Netherlands, Germany and the east coast of Jutland, and Baltic amber, from the south and eastern coasts of the Baltic Sea. To find out which of these amber coasts he went to, we'll have a look at the text to find some clues. The estuary that was mentioned in the text might have not referred to an actual estuary, as this term could have also been used more generally to refer to any stretch of water. Some options of what the body of water known as Montonomon may have been are the German Bight, the Skagerrak, or even the Baltic Sea as a whole. The extent of this territory is a mystery as well. Some have speculated, as this is the rough distance from the Skagerrak to the Vistula River, that Pytheas might have travelled as far as the Vistula. But this is all just speculation. It's unclear whether this distance refers to the extent of Montonomon in general, or just the part which this tribe inhabits. Speaking of the tribes, two are mentioned here as living on a stretch of tidal coast, the Geones being the inhabitants of this area, and the Teutones or Teutons being their neighbors. As for the Geones, future geographers don't refer to this tribe by this name, so there are two interpretations of which tribe Pytheas is describing here. One of them being the tribe known as the Gutones or Gutons, also more commonly referred to as the Goths. This tribe is thought to have inhabited the region around the Vistula, so that might connect it to the claim that Pytheas went as far as this river. There is one problem, however. The Goths aren't thought to have migrated to this area until the 1st century BCE at the earliest, so they wouldn't have been there at the time of Pytheas. that means the only point we have to support the claim that Pytheas went to the Vistula is this measurement of distance, which, as mentioned earlier, is iffy at best. It doesn't entirely rule out that he didn't go into the Baltic. As we look into where the Gutones were thought to inhabit at the time of Pytheas, we see that they are about the same distance as the Vistula from the Skagerrak, only on the other side of the Baltic Sea in Scandinavia. The neighboring tribe mentioned in the text, the Teutones or Teutons, have been placed in a variety of locations throughout the centuries. But as to where to place them during Antiquity, the best source we have comes from Pomponius Mela's work, Description of the World.
On the other side of the Albis, the huge Codanus Bay is filled with big and small islands. For this reason, where the sea is received within the fold of the bay, it never lies wide open and never really looks like a sea, but is sprinkled around, rambling and scattered like rivers, with water flowing in every direction and crossing many times. Where the sea comes into contact with the mainland, the sea is contained by the banks of islands, banks that are not far offshore and that are virtually equidistant everywhere. There the sea runs a narrow course like a strait, then, curving, it promptly adapts to a long brow of land. On the bay are the Cimbri and the Teutoni. Of the islands there, Codanavia, which the Teutoni still hold, stands out as much for its size as for its fertility besides.
Codanus Bay is believed to be the part of the Baltic Sea around the Danish islands. The Teutons are said to inhabit one of the largest islands here, so that might be Zealand, but it's worth noting that back then Scandinavia was thought to be an island as well, as they hadn't discovered yet that it was a peninsula connected at the far end of the Baltic Sea. So that means to Pomponius, the southern tip of what we now know as Sweden would have been considered an island within this group. And this is more than likely the region he is referring to when he talks about the territory of the Teutons. He even calls the island Codonavia, which is the name from which the term Scandinavia is derived. With the Teutones inhabiting this area, it would make them neighbors to the Gutons. Now if we go back to Pliny's text, there is also mention of an island named Abalus, which is about 1 day sail away and known for its amber. There is a prominent island, Gotland, within the Gothic territory. While amber does wash up here, this island and this region of the Swedish coast in general has a relatively low abundance of amber compared to other places, as the majority of Baltic amber tends to wash up on the southeastern and eastern sides of the Baltic shore. There is another option of which tribe the Giones might have been, that being the Ingiones, who inhabited the coasts of Jutland and Holstein, thus also making them neighbors of the Teutons. To me it seems far more likely that this is the tribe talked about here. The Igniones inhabited the region right on the Juttish Amber coast, and the most likely option for being the island of Abalus is the modern-day island of Helegoland. Laying about 1 day sail away from the mainland, this island is right in the middle of the region where Juttish Amber is found. The inhabitants of this island are said to burn amber for fuel in their fires, and while using amber to fuel a fire is possible, a lot of other materials would be way easier to burn and also more fuel efficient. So it has been theorized that perhaps these inhabitants weren't burning amber to fuel their fires, but rather they might have burnt it with a more religious or spiritual meaning behind it. While this is the most agreed upon explanation for this island of Abalus, there's also another way to interpret this text. Until now we have assumed a pretty big link between this tribe of the Giones and the island. But another point of view is that the island of Abalus is meant to be separate from this tribe, with the neighboring Teutons not necessarily having to be neighbors of the Giones, but just of the island of Abalus. With this in mind, I also wanted to propose the island of Bornholm, which in itself would neighbour the territory of the Teutons on the mainland. While still not as abundant as the eastern regions of the Baltic, on this island amber is washed up as well. It would be about a day's sail to the mainland, but that mainland would be inhabited by the Teutons. And one thing that the text does specify is that the territory one day sail away from this island is inhabited by the Geonis, and Bornholm would be too far away from that no matter which tribe you assume to be the Geonis. It is also entirely possible that, as tribes move quite frequently, and the closest accounts of the locations of these tribes come from a few hundred years after Pytheas, means that these tribes might have moved around in this area, in which case identifying the island of Abylos would be near on impossible. And it could as well be any island within this region. But since this group of islands, as later described by Pomponius Mela, is quite interesting regarding the flow of the ocean, it makes me believe that if Pytheas did actually reach these islands, he would have made detailed descriptions about them, as this unique region of water flow would have been highly interesting to him. Because this is lacking, I feel like Pytheas wouldn't actually have gone into the Baltic Sea, making it more likely that he was just talking about the amber coast of Jutland. With that in mind, I wanted to suggest one more option where Pytheas possibly could have gone. Some have suggested that the district of Thule in northwestern Denmark is etymologically linked to the Teutons. Thule is thought to be derived from the Old Norse Theat, which meant people, and a medieval source names this region as Thute Sicil, Thute sounding similar to Teuton. So it may have been possible that the Teutons at some point inhabited this area. And in Ptolemy's map from the 2nd century, he places the Teutons in this area as well. That is of course far later than any other source I've used in this video. But could it be possible that the Teutons may have inhabited this area, then moved over to Scandinavia, and then moved back by the time of Ptolemy? If we do go along with this theory, Pytheas could have sailed north from the Geonis' territory, and depending on where the border was exactly, it could have taken him about a day's journey to come to this region. There are a few small islands in this neighborhood, so one of these could have been Abylos, and traded the amber with the nearby Teutons. Of his return home, no descriptions remain. The most likely route he took to get home was by boat, following a similar route he took to his outward journey. There's also another option, that from here he travelled over land up to the lower Rhine, where Massalia had trading outposts, and that way made it back to his home city. Though if he had taken this route, I feel like he would have made some interesting descriptions about the tribes inhabiting this inland region, and since nothing is mentioned, the sea journey seems the more likely. We also don't know how long this whole trip would have taken him. It could have been months or even years if he waited for a real solstice every time he took a measurement. When he returned home, he wrote his book. He must have written it before the year 320 BCE, as it is around this time that we first see it being quoted by other scholars. But it is possible that he had written it sometime before and it just hadn't become widespread yet. So it is believed that the actual journey might have taken place sometime in the 330s or 320s BCE, with the book probably having been written sometime in the 320s. Since you're still here, I hope I've earned your subscription. Please like the video and also leave a comment with your thoughts below. And if you want to support me further, please consider donating via Super Thanks or on my Patreon page. You can find the people who voiced the quotes in the description below. And a special thanks to my $25 patron G. David.